Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So a couple of months ago, I shared a story about myself as a young child and not being able to see, and eventually having to get glasses. I have a story about when I was 5 years old. We were at a family reunion out on a lake. We were out there fishing on this pier. And I'm sitting there on a bench on this pier. Right in front of me is my young cousin, who is also 5 years old. And he's got a fishing line and he's fishing in the lake. So I'm sitting there with my big glasses, and all of a sudden, everything goes blank. My cousin, who was fishing, had thrown the line behind him. The hook caught hold of the bridge of my glasses and threw them into the lake with the line. I will say the next couple of weeks were pretty rough without glasses. I was running into things. I couldn't read things. But the worst thing was, I couldn't recognize the people who were right in front of me. This is a story of blindness that I think resonates well with the gospel for today. Here we have a story of a blind man who is blind from birth and can't see, can't recognize anybody. But yet, he comes to grow in faith in Jesus and recognize who Jesus was. On the other hand, we have a group of people who ideally can see. They have all the wisdom in the world, but they eventually become blind because they can't see Jesus. This is the group called the Pharisees. So here we have Jesus walking along, sees a blind man, decides to spit in the dirt, makes clay with it, rubs it in the guy's eyes, and says, "Go and wash," and he's able to see. And as a result, this blind man, his faith grows in Jesus. But then there's those obstinate Pharisees who just don't seem to accept what just happened. They can't seem to accept that a miracle has just happened in their midst. They are so focused on these little details of keeping rules and regulations that they fail to see how God has just acted in their midst. They fail to see this miracle that's right in front of them. It's almost as if the glasses on them have been yanked by a fish hook and thrown away from them so that they can no longer see. Now, I'm not comparing myself as a 5-year-old to the Pharisees, because I probably didn't have sins back then. I wouldn't be proud like them. But you see how these Pharisees were able to see at one time. They had all the spiritual wisdom in the world. They had the law. They were well-educated people. They were very morally upright and religious people. They tried to serve God with all their will by following the laws that God had set forth. Sort of like a lot of us today in this church. We try to serve God the best way that we can. But in focusing on all those little rules and details, these Pharisees lost sight of the one important thing right in front of their very faces. They lost sight of the Son of God, God-made man, right in front of them, who had just performed this amazing miracle on a blind man. And they failed to see it. They're so focused on this little rule that you can't perform a miracle on the Sabbath day because you're not supposed to do any work. They get fixated on that little thing. And so then what happens? They come up with excuses for Jesus' work. They say, this man isn't really from God. He doesn't have temple credentials, so he shouldn't be performing these miracles. And these miracles, we don't believe they were miracles. We think this blind guy was just making it up. He wasn't really blind in the first place. These Pharisees are allowing these little things to get in the way of the big picture that Jesus is working right in their midst. And so the blind man says not once, not twice, not 3 times. Or not once, not twice, but 3 times he says to them, "This is what Jesus has done for me, and you still don't believe me." They're failing to recognize how Jesus, God, is working in their midst. So we might ask, what is their problem? What's the deal? They just witnessed this miracle. This guy who was a beggar, who they saw every day at the temple, and they still don't believe that Jesus had worked a miracle. What's their problem? I think the problem is this. As very religious people, as people who have these set rules and regulations, they failed to see how God might be at work in the unexpected ways. They didn't see how God could be at work in this blind beggar who they deemed a sinner. They thought that God had to be only at work in these neat, nice categories, that God could only work within themselves, in religious people, in the temple. We might ask ourselves, how do we fall into that trap too? We expect God oftentimes to work only in these neat, nice categories. Sometimes we think that God can only be at work in our church here, on this altar, in the midst of the community here, in the midst of holy people and holy places. Sometimes we fall into the trap of thinking that only God can work inside a church. The only sacred place is inside a church. So then we fail to see how God might be at work in, say, a dysfunctional family. We fail to see how God might be at work in, say, a drug addict who's struggling with an addiction and trying to overcome it. We fail to see how God might be at work in a family who is struggling with financial issues. But those are precisely the places that God is at work. And so when we fail to see that, we fall into this Pharisaical way of thinking, that God can only be working in specific places, at certain times, and in certain people. Only in holy people God could be at work. That's often the trap that people fall into. That's often a trap that many of us fall into. But no, God is not at work only in holy people. He's at work all around us. Those times where families are struggling with difficulty, those times where we have difficulty in our own families getting along with each other, the Lord is at work. He's at work in our parents, for those of us who are younger and sometimes are tired of our parents. He's at work in them. For those of us who are tired of our kids, He's at work in them. For our children and family members who may be distant from God, the Lord is at work among them. The Lord is at work in that person who may be asking us for money on the side of the road. That person who is suffering from daily life and seems to be ignored. The Lord is at work in that person and is calling out to us oftentimes to help. But when we put on the blinders and when we think that God can only be at work in certain places and in certain people, we fail to realize how God really manifests Himself in this world. Jesus manifested Himself in a poor world, in the Middle East, in a poor family. He makes Himself very much incarnate. He takes on a person, and God takes on a person here in our midst as well. In the midst of all of us, the person right in front of us who we may not think the presence of God dwells within. But when we put on those glasses, the lens of Christ, the lens of the vision of the blind beggar who saw Jesus right in front of him, he saw a divine power right in front of him. Then we're able to look at the world with a totally different vision. We're able to see how God is working right in our midst. But if we keep those glasses off, we see like the Pharisees, and we can't see how God is working in our midst. You might be wondering what happened to my glasses that day. Well, they sat at the bottom of that lake for a couple of weeks, till a family member of mine went diving into the lake and found them. Like, they were covered with fish parts and all kinds of stuff that you'd find in a lake. But after washing them off and putting them on, I was able to see again. My sight was restored, and I was able to recognize the people who were right in front of me. And it's the same spiritual way of thinking that we can bring into our own way of thinking every day. To see the presence of God in the midst of us, to allow the Lord to cure us of our blindness, to smear that clay on our eyes so that we may be opened up, and to recognize the way that He's working right in our very midst. Amen.
Amen.